Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Elaine Deschamps. I'm really excited to be here today and chair this practitioner session on best practices for forecasting at scale. I'm on the IIF board of directors and I'm a fellow practitioner as I run a budget forecasting agency in Washington State. I'll just real briefly introduce our featured speakers and then turn it over to them. I'd like to introduce to you Ginger Holt and Italo Lima. Ginger is a manager in data science infrastructure at Facebook. Her 15 years of experience in forecasting and time series analysis also include forecasting demand for Walmart and HP and quantitative energy trading analysis at BP. She received her PhD in statistics and she has served as professor at universities including SMU, Northwestern University, San Jose State University, and University of Virginia. And now I'd like to introduce Italo Lima. Italo is senior data scientist at Netflix. And before that, he's worked in forecasting on Facebook's infrastructure data scientists. He has a PhD in statistics and has worked for the financial industry before moving to the tech world. And one last thing before I turn things over is just to make sure if you'd like to ask questions, use that Q&A feature, and also you can use the chat. So I'm pleased to welcome Ginger and Italo.
For the introduction.
Thank you, Elaine.
Easy to remember your name. That's my mother's name. I'm honored to be presenting this talk with my first hire at Facebook, Italo, forming my new forecasting team there about 3.5 years ago. I was thrilled with the opportunity to visit Rio, as we all were, with a bunch of my forecasting team. Unfortunately, that's going to have to wait for another time. Yeah, so since 3.5 years ago, we now have 20 plus data scientists working in forecasting for capacity planning. And in this talk, we're going to talk about some of the challenges we faced and are still facing in our forecasting journey, as well as some solutions that we have developed. We've categorized these challenges into 3 types: organizational, practical, and technical. And we'll also share some solutions that we've developed to tackle these challenges. Hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And I know this is a very broad audience, so we're aiming to give you a few key takeaways, either as a practitioner, a researcher, a forecasting consumer, whether you're trying to forecast, start a forecasting team yourself, or you're growing your forecasting efforts in your company. I'll start out with some of the organizational challenges we've encountered. So we are infrastructure data science, and any organization, especially a large one like Facebook, will face challenges when building up forecasting capability and making data-driven decisions around capacity planning. Finding the right people, forming the right cross-functional interaction, and making good forecasting investment decisions are what I will talk about in this section. Our team, Infrastructure Data Science, or IDS, if I use that acronym, manages many forecasts for capacity, including user demand. This varies by resource, networking, storage, or compute resources. Our primary forecasting partners are capacity engineering and other product teams who need to plan the capacity supply for their products and services. In many cases, it's a 0 to 1 type effort, right? We're just developing the capability to create a forecast for the first time. Oftentimes when we get results, partners are not satisfied with the accuracy. They don't know what to expect for accuracy, or they think it should be higher. Of course, different time series contain different levels of volatility. So for example, user behavior is a lot more volatile than a well-behaved mechanical system. In a stochastic system, there will always be a certain amount of variability, which is unexplained. And decomposing the overall variability into the explained and unexplained components can be a useful activity to demonstrate to stakeholders how much noise the system has compared with other types of time series. So that's been a good way to explain some of the accuracy numbers. And in order to increase the chance of buy-in from the partners, our forecasting models require a lot of subject matter input and explainability. Partners really desire an understanding of the model in order to gain confidence in the output. Earlier today, we had a session of forecasting at scale with 4 of my Facebook colleagues. So I'll point you to that throughout the talk if you want to learn more about some of these in greater detail. So earlier today, there's some explainability content in Sudeep Srivastava and Hey Chalson's talk. Partners who use our forecast as input into another forecasting effort make accountability for accuracy challenging. If we don't own the forecasting methodology end to end, then we can't assess or find root causes for the inaccuracies. Here's a plot showing more, it's an example of that inherent volatility. So these are 2 different time series. So this is an example of how we would set expectation for the level of accuracy. So we have 2 user metrics here, daily active people and active last minute users. So the daily active people, that's how many people are active on Facebook that day, is much smoother, it's the orange line here, than the ALM, which is the blue one. Even though they're measured at the same granularity, they have day of week seasonality, but the peak to trough is much higher in ALM versus DAB. Both of these metrics are measuring engagement, but we see that the blue series has a lot more inherent volatility. And the trend of the daily active people is linear with several slope changes. And we're usually doing a lot of long-term forecasting, and long-term predictions much more difficult for series that have trend changes or jumps. And the impact of your forecasting work can be shown by computing a relative accuracy for your model compared to a naive method or a mean method. So this has helped us with some of the explainability requests from our partners. The next challenge is around recruiting. Recruiting both externally and internally have been challenging. We recruit generalists into our organization and for data science. And these generalists have a broad range of data science expertise. Data science on the forecasting team requires also very good cross-functional skills. There's a lot of subject matter knowledge that needs to be acquired, a lot of stakeholders that we have to work with. So the work is high stakes. We have last year we had around $15 billion in capital expenditures. So it's a lot of money that we're investing in growing our infrastructures. We have a lot of stakeholders and interested parties that we need to work with. A lot of opinions also weighing in along the way. Also, to touch on the ML interests, a lot of DSs want to work with ML methodologies, and that may not be consistent with some of the explainability requirements that our partners have for the models. Another concern with the recruiting internally, especially one of our values as a company, is to focus on impact. And that's sometimes hard to show, especially if your partners have unrealistic expectations around accuracy. The fact that forecasts will always be wrong, it's not a real good tagline or seller for the work, especially when you have many more projects where the impact may seem larger. So we've had to do a lot of work to convince people that the impact is big and get buy-in from the leadership on how to do this. When you're doing long-term forecasting, the first thing you need to think about is storing your data as soon as possible. You won't be able to assess true accuracy for a while, so you should store actuals and forecasts at many different forecast generation dates and for many different time horizons. We've had a lot of questions around accuracy for different timelines. You'll never know which requests are going to be coming in, so better to get that data in order as soon as possible. Tooling. The right tooling will allow you to scale much faster. We've made the decision to invest in developing good tooling in-house, which provides forecasters with easy automation, fast computation through parallelization, also customizing it by the user, and providing good visualization tools for our partners to visualize the forecast. Our forecasting models can be complex, but many of the time series we forecast have similar behaviors and features. So getting the tooling right is very important. With regards to people, so if you look at the picture of this data scientist on the right, look how happy this data scientist looks while writing documentation. Oh, if only that were true, right? I mean, so documentation is, nobody wants to do it. We've had to place more emphasis on documentation due to the frequent turnover of people owning particular forecasts. So we've been expanding the number of forecasts we provide substantially. So you have a lot of turnover, people working on new forecast and passing on work to new people joining the team. So it's hard to transfer the subject matter expertise that goes along with these forecasts without any documentation. Another way we've structured the work for data scientists working in forecasting, we allow a minor area. So if they are working in another area of our organization, we have the flexibility to let them have a minor in forecasting. People are interested in learning about methodologies and techniques. So this gives them the opportunity to do that, but still not make a substantial commitment until they've been able to try it out for a little while. The way we do our road mapping, so for our infrastructure data science forecasting team, when we make our forecasting roadmap, every forecaster is allocated a specific vertical, and by that I mean a forecasting deliverable to our partner team. So something forecasts are actually delivering. Also, they're allocated a horizontal, which is, think of it as a methodological module, which allows for repeatability. So, and then the third part is the tooling. So we develop our tooling in-house, and we're trying to build up a standardized toolkit, which has consistency across all the tools in our company. And so we want to develop that tool by adding these methodological modules and allowing for repeatability of the work. So this is good because many of the time series that we forecast have similar features and behaviors. So when a data scientist delivers a forecast to a partner, and they also own the module that is related to that deliverable, then we can pass that on to other forecasters who can reuse that module. Also, we collaborate with another org specifically around the tooling. So the org is called Data Products. We're not software engineers, we're data scientists. So we've partnered with our Data Products organization. They are tooling experts. And so we combined our forecasting expertise with their tooling and engineering expertise. on developing the best forecasting tooling that we can use throughout Facebook. Forecasting at Facebook is not only performed within our org, infrastructure data science, but in many other teams as well. For 2 years, Italo and I have organized a company-wide forecasting summit, which brings together people who are doing forecasting work across the company. We have an external speaker day and an internal speaker day. And the purpose of this is to form new collaborations across the company, educate people on new and existing methodologies that are available, discover new tools, and assess common feature needs for our current tooling. We also had an unanticipated exciting outcome from our first summit in that we were able to recruit an external speaker. You may have heard of him. It's Slavik Smil. He won the M4 competition. So welcome, Slavik. The last point is around forecast consistency. Related forecasts across the company may not be consistent with each other. Forecasts made with the goal of not running out of capacity may differ with user growth forecasts, which are usually made as a target. Understanding the difference in goals of these forecasts and trying to reconcile those differences or biases in the forecast is important. When these forecasts are owned by different teams, collaboration and education amongst the teams is beneficial. So I will hand it over now to Italo to talk to you about some of the practical and technical challenges.
Perfect. Ginger, I was just going to ask, would you like to take this one question before we move to Italo for you, or would you like to wait till the end?
Sure.
The one question for you is, will you continue in the long term with a non-ML emphasis given the progress being made in AI ML explainability?
Definitely not. And you'll see, I wouldn't have to answer that question if we got to the end of the talk. So yeah, you'll see more advancements there. Yeah. Thanks for the question though. Good motivating question for the the end. Yeah. Great. I'll pass it over to Italo now.
Thank you, Ginger. Sorry, maybe I give you a signal and you change slides?
Yeah, that's
perfect. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the practical and technical challenges that we had in doing pretty much everything that Ginger talked about, and some of the solutions that we have come up with and we are implementing and or have implemented in the past. Yep. So some of the practical challenges that we get, the first one is how do we onboard forecast? So most of the forecasts that we're going to do, there is a lot of pre-forecast work. So what do I mean by this is usually we don't get a clear time series that we want to forecast and we just need to do the forecast. We actually got a problem that we need to understand what is exactly the final goal that we want to solve and have to choose what is the right metric to do the forecast. After we can find a metric that makes sense and that's going to really help us understand our final objective, then we need to understand what is the right granularity that we need for the forecast. And this might include temporal granularity as well as the longitudinal or just the grouping forecast. So from the temporal side, Ginger showed before some forecasts about or some time series about daily active people and active last minute forecasts. Those actually, they have different granularities. So she was showing the daily granularity, but actually the ALM or the active last minute, as the name implies, they actually have a minute level forecast granularity. So understanding where we want to stay with our forecast, if we want to forecast a daily ALM in some way, or if we just want to forecast on a minute level, it has some problems that we need to solve over there. And also when looking at the longitudinal granularity, we are usually faced with several different choices. So for example, when we were talking about daily active people, we are not talking about overall. We can talk about different products that we have within the company, or even different regions, geographical regions, or different countries, and all of that. So we need our first part that we need to do, even before we think about doing forecast, is answering all of these needs. After we got a good idea about this, then there is the part of setting up ETL jobs to process the data and start collecting the data. Like Ginger mentioned, collecting the data early and often is something pretty important. That is not always present, of course. So setting up these ETL jobs are something that is pretty necessary as well. After we have that, we will have everything that we need to start forecasting. And that's when we are going to start some of the procedures that we need to do. There are several things that we need before we can put this into production. So having a clear playbook or even automated methodologies become very important. And that's something that also, as Ginger mentioned, in terms of tooling, we have invested quite a lot. Some of the things that we need to do is in terms of data quality control. So most of our time series, they're going to come from some upstream tables. So there is some data that we are transforming and doing something that we can finally get to the time series that we need. In these upstream dependencies, they can and often they will break our time series, our data. So some of the things that can happen are, for example, adding new products to our to whatever we are forecasting, or adding new regions or adding new countries. So all of this, if we don't have a good control on the quality of the data, they can break automated tools. Also, we usually make assumptions about temporal granularity of the data, like I mentioned before. So for example, some time series, they can have initially a minute level availability, and maybe after a while this becomes a daily availability. If we don't take that into account as well, this can break our automated pipelines. So all of this we need to control as well. Another thing that can happen pretty often is some errors that happen just in the data collection or in the data upstream, and that can lead to outliers that are not really real data. So that is also something that we need to control, and we're gonna talk a little bit more in the last step. After we do this, we do need to select what is the best model to do the forecast, and that's usually where most of the work is gonna go in terms of the data scientist itself, is gonna be testing different models, understanding the advantages and disadvantages of each one, and trying to select the best. We do have a lot of developments in this side to try to scale this and make it more automatic. And I'm going to talk a little bit later, but a spoiler alert over here, there is a talk, like Ginger mentioned, in one of our other invited sessions where we can go in a lot more details on that. After we can have a good understanding of the model selection, and this is also going to include hyperparameter tuning and all of that, we have the issue of forecasted publication and presentation. So we try to forecast as often as we can and update our model as often as possible. So publishing these forecasts in a good way where there is no confusion. And remember that most of these forecasts, they will be consumed by other teams. So having a clear communication on how we publish these are extremely important. And after that, another thing that becomes extremely also important is having automatic monitoring. So like I mentioned before, the data quality control is something extremely important. Changes in upstream can break this, and that's where automatic monitoring helps a lot. We usually separate our monitoring two types of movements that can happen. The first one is problems in the data itself or outliers in the data. And what I usually mean by this is when we have fast movement. So maybe one particular day there was a huge increase or decrease in a particular metric, or that could be caused by a real event. Maybe something happened that made some usage increase or something like this. Or it may be, which is also often the case, it just may be some problem with the data. So maybe some logging got broken and that is influencing the forecast itself. The second kind of monitoring that we need to do is a model quality deterioration. So of course, when you're modeling all of this, we are assuming a certain data generation or a certain model that best fits that data. but that might not hold true forever. So maybe like some trend has changed or some way of calculating or some measurement of the seasonality has changed and the model is not adequate anymore. So we also need to be aware of that so we can intervene and fix it. And besides these fast and slow movements, there is always mix of the two as well. And one big example, of course, was COVID, where we had a very fast movement in utilization, but that also changed how our models were performing with the data. So they were not just a single outlier, they were actually long-term effects as well. So after we tackle these problems, this actually becomes kind of like a cycle that when we have automatic monitoring, we can use that to input into our data quality control, improving the quality of our data, which is in turn gonna help us with model selection. And that will improve also the automatic monitoring after that. And to do all of this, we develop an internal tool to this forecasting dashboard that we have over here, where we try to condense everything that I mentioned about the practical challenges into one single place. So we have in the top left corner over here, a place where people can select the forecast date with very clear indications on what is the published forecast or the official forecast in a certain way. And people can compare this with more updated forecasts or just adding new data. On the lower left corner, we have an error monitoring where we can follow over time how our forecast is performing with respect to some metric that we choose. And finally, we have in the main section over here, we can see the forecast itself, where we always present the data itself of the forecast that we have and the uncertainty estimation or prediction intervals that we made with that model as well. One thing that is missing over here is in this same tool, we can also present the automatic monitoring that I mentioned. So whenever we detect that something is not right, either with the forecast itself or with the data, we can actually highlight in this tool and kick off a certain series of automatic measurements or measures to alert the right people about those outliers. After we get some of these practical challenges, we can actually talk a little bit about the technical issues that we have when dealing with these practical challenges. So there are a few things that we can talk about. The first one is the idea of holiday or special events. And this goes a little bit with that idea of outliers. The prediction interval and uncertainty intervals, which are extremely important, especially when we have downstream teams consuming our forecasts and making decisions using those. And then there is the hierarchical reconciliation, where we can talk a little bit about the whole idea that it's not about just doing one forecast, it's about selecting the right granularity in terms of longitudinal granularity. There is the problem of temporal reconciliation, and that was very clear when COVID happened, when we are trying to reconcile now some forecast that is happening and changing very quickly in the short term, but we still want to have it robust in the long term. There is the problem of model comparison and hyperparameter tuning, which we can have a nice approach that tries to capture both at the same time. So starting with the idea of the holiday and special events, that is something that is very present in pretty much all of our capacity time series. There are kind of two models or two types of special events that can happen. The first one is the whole idea of peak prediction. And just giving a little bit of a reference over here, Ploy and Rakshita, two of the data scientists with IDS, they actually presented a talk earlier today about forecasting peak demand for infrastructure, which was exactly trying to tackle this problem that we have. And the problem with peak prediction is that there are some events, and the one famous one is New Year's Eve, where they have a very strong but very brief effect in our metrics. So for New Year's Eve, you have very strong increase in our metrics, but they last maybe a couple of minutes at most. So you have very hard to collect and very hard to model these events. The second type of special events that happen are whole seasonal pattern shifts, where instead of having something that happened very quickly, like New Year's Eve, you have something that lasts a lot longer. Some couple of examples when this happens is like in summer, where things change a little bit in terms of usage, or a big holiday in terms of the Ramadan, that can also change the effect for a long time. These graphs over here that we have are actually for some of the days where the Ramadan has happened. So these are days that are on the same day of the week, so we don't have the week day effect. But you can see that on the days that you have Ramadan, the behavior of the usage is actually shifted. And just to clarify this graph a little bit, these are measuring 20 minutes interval. So this part over here where you have the second peak, they're actually pretty much like late at night. And you can see that there is a change in the behavior of the people accessing this particular metric that pushes their usage more to the late of night rather than early in the day as it was before. So these type of changes in pattern, they make it very hard to forecast directly. So what we have opted for is to actually have two methods. One where we try to forecast overall what is happening with the data. And the second part is where we try to predict specifically these peaks. And for more details on how exactly we do that, I think it's very useful to go to this talk over here, which should be recorded and available pretty soon if you missed it. The second problem that we have is what we were talking about, hierarchical reconciliation. And in here, there are two kind of parts that we can go. The first one is, like I mentioned before, where we have different products. So for example, when we are trying to give an overall metric, there is some, at some certain cases, there is kind of cannibalization. Yeah, there are like changes in how people are using the product. So sometimes if we are looking at a particular product A, people might migrate to a product B, even within the Facebook family of apps. And that can change how we do the forecast. So that's something that is pretty important in understanding. There are also new products that are added in that can both cannibalize and change people, which products they are accessing specifically, and also can change the behavior of people after that. And there are also demographical effects, like I mentioned, for example, before about summer. During summer, at least in the US, there are people, teens are off school. So this can change as well how people are accessing our products. The second kind of reconciliation that we need to do is in terms of geographical changes. So there are, for example, in changes in connectivity, like people start to access a little bit more, they have access to more internet in certain countries, and you see a change in how they are accessing our services and all of that. And this becomes important because there are lower level noisy time series. So if we go on country level forecast, which helps overall in doing the forecast, it can actually also introduce noise. So that becomes also a complicated, a challenging part of doing this forecast overall. And that's a little bit what Sudeep and Hichal talked earlier today. So that's another talk that also I can point with more details on how we fix this hierarchical reconciliation for our capacity planning. And just as some example of how strong it can be, the next slide, it actually shows the hierarchical forecast per region, and this is geographical region. So we go Africa, Asia Pacific, Canada, all the way to Middle East and US. And you can see each one of these individually, they are changing a lot over time. So each one of these stacked areas, they are changing over time until 2023. And the impact when you combine the whole thing, and that goes also in the fact that We are forecasting here on an hourly level. So there is the time zone differences, which adds to that nonlinearity on aggregating all of these forecasts. And you can see that it changes the behavior or the overall curve by quite a lot when you consider the fact that each of the regions is moving a different rate. Another problem that we do have is what I mentioned about prediction intervals or uncertainty estimation. And the way that we tackle this, like the problem that we have over here, and I mentioned before, is that there are downstream teams who are consuming our forecast, and they are making decisions based on this forecast. So we don't want them to make decision based, of course, only on the point estimation of our forecast. We want to understand possible scenarios of what could happen in the future. So understanding the uncertainty of our forecast becomes something extremely important. The way that we try to tackle this is by periodically refreshing our forecast and keeping our error monitoring, keeping a very close eye on our error monitoring. That's what I have over here, like looking at the error metrics and finding a appropriate error metric to monitor our forecast. After we have this error monitoring, one thing that we found that works pretty well is to have an empirical estimation of prediction intervals, where we look at how our model has performed in the past, pretty much doing a back test, estimating what is the uncertainty of this, and projecting this to the future. So that is something that we can get a very good coverage on our prediction intervals, and gives a lot more trust for our partners that are consuming this forecast in regards to how well we can forecast this time series. Finally, the last thing that we do is, or the last thing that I want to talk is in terms of model comparison. So there are several related forecasts that we can compare, and doing this comparison, they are going to depend a lot on which metric we are trying to optimize for. So one thing that happens quite a lot is we can try to optimize for averages, like, for example, using a MAPE. But a lot of times the downstream teams who are consuming our forecast, they actually are not interested in averages. So for example, they might be more interested in a short-term forecast or long-term. And finding the correct metric to optimize and to compare this forecast is something pretty important as well. That's something that we spent some time thinking about. And there is also the fact that there are likely to be some inaccuracies in lower level granularity. So if you're thinking about the idea of forecasting a global metric, but we want to do a country level as well, it's very likely that the country level are going to have a higher level of inaccuracy. But so this also becomes a problem, for example, when you're doing hyperparameter tuning, that we want to balance this whole idea that we're doing a hierarchical, and maybe we want to focus on the global versus looking at a specific country level. And this goes well into some of the solutions that we have found. The first one is investing quite a lot in doing a good hyperparameter tuning system. So hyperparameter is the whole idea that we are trying to understand a particular parameter that is not exactly trained as the model itself, and can be usually manually set given a particular domain. So giving as an example profit, it has a lot of parameters for trend, seasonality, and other type of parameters. So if we understand from the domain that the trend is increasing at a particular rate, we can change a little bit of this into profit. Or if we understand, for example, that the last few months are most important, we can actually change how much we want to include in the trend forecast, or the same thing for seasonality. So this becomes very complicated, even though profit, for example, was one of the models that we use because it makes a lot easier to do this. It's still very hard because you need to understand both profit and the domain, and you need to do this for like a few thousand time series. That becomes very hard. And that's where we go into the next part, which is like setting a good API for doing hyperparameter tuning. So if we can offload this to computation, it makes much easier. So that's what we invested into doing. So we invested into setting a good evaluation function And that's the point where we need to understand what is the evaluation function. Like, are we focusing on short term, a long term, or overall? And how are we evaluating hierarchical hierarchical groups of forecasts and all of that? And then we can create like a search agent, which is going to search a particular space, and that's going to depend also on the model specifically that we're using. And that's where we need to spend a little bit of time defining well the models that we're doing, and finally the search strategy that we're going to do. So one, for example, is the grid search, which is like just a brute force pretty much search. Works really well if you have a limited computing, or you can do like some more iterative one after the other search. So for example, random search, which sometimes works well, or it is even better, some Bayesian optimization search. And here you can also give a reference, again, putting a little bit to Facebook, but there is something called adaptive experimentation. You can search on GitHub, it's open source, that does this Bayesian optimization, and we had a lot of luck using it. The other thing is, like I mentioned before, setting these hyperparameters can be very complicated if you are not both an expert on the model and the domain. So using this automated approach makes it much easier and much more scalable. That's something that we can do for all of our time series and just offload this to doing a little bit more computation. The other part is, we were talking about hyperparameter, I was talking about a profit, but maybe profit is not even the right model. And that's where going a little bit beyond the hyperparameter tuning gets a lot of interest. And that's the point that Ginger was answering the question before about like, what can we do in terms of ML? And again, pointing to a talk that we had earlier today from Sheldon, one of our members of IDS as well. He, with one of the interns, developed a method for doing self-supervised learning. So pretty much trying to learn both the hyperparameter, but also which model should we use by only looking at the time series. This is based on things like developed by, if I'm not mistaken, by Hinman and Christoph as well. But this can give a lot of much easier model selection, where you don't have to know exactly what the model is doing, exchanging for a little bit of computation. So that is another approach. And this goes also in the next part, which Ginger highlighted, which is the tooling. So investing in to do all that I said before in a way that we can do like for thousands of time series and onboarding many more. That becomes very complicated if you're doing all of this manually, or even if you need to launch all of these hyperparameter tunings by yourself. So that's one part that we invested a lot. And as Ginger mentioned, we're not software engineers, but we partnered with another team called Data Products that helped develop this tool called Forecaster, which can enable everyone to make good informed decisions with forecasting. So it's very integrated within the Facebook tools. So we can easily get all of the time series that we want and everything. And all of the back end preparation that is needed, it automatically goes over there. And what I think is even more important is that it has all of these methodological modules. So pretty much everything that I talked, you can just plug into the tool, and that can be used directly into this forecaster. And finally comes the last and one of the most important things is that even though I have a lot of solutions for this, there is a lot that can be done yet and a lot of things that needs to be implemented. So there is some academic collaborations that we try to do, and there is one that is ongoing with Monash University with Christoph Bergemeyer and Hansika, together with Stanford University with Oscar and Dr. Ram Raja Gopal, where we are trying to, it's all about open research. So all of this is open source tools and everything that we are developing, but they are guided by real industry problems that we are having. And this goes a little bit biased on the problems that we specifically at Facebook were having. And one of the things that are coming out of that is neuroprofit. And that is, again, another talk that we had this morning, and just pointing that direction as well, where Oscar presented a lot more details about this. And finally, like Ginger mentioned, there is the Forecasting Summit, which we organize every year. And there is this external speaker day where people can come and presenting things about forecasting as well. Pretty sure that Ginger is gonna organize another one for next year. So I can also happy to, if you're interested in talking a little bit more about forecasting, happy to contact Ginger and she should point you in the right direction. And finally, something that Facebook does quite a lot is to present these research awards where for things that we consider important to be solved in general, you can apply for it and get some awards to do some research in that area. There is another one coming in March, and maybe Ginger can give more info about that as well. The main POC, of course, for all of this is Ginger. This is her email, so feel free to contact her directly to get more info about the Forecasting Summit or the Research Awards. Yep. And with this, I think we can open for questions.
Yes, thank you for a terrific presentation. Very, very interesting, really insightful. There is one more question on the Q&A, and I invite others to type away. This one is, do you have thoughts on who should manage the uncertainty? The forecasting team or the downstream consuming team that makes decisions based on the forecast?
Yeah, that is a very hard question. I don't think I have a perfect answer for that. I'm going to put a little bit of my personal bias on this. I think we, as doing forecast, one thing that we can provide is the uncertainty of the model that we are doing itself. So we can try to give how sure we are that forecast is correct or not. On top of that, there might be other uncertainties that we as forecast, like, or at least me as doing the forecasting, I don't know about, that the team itself can add on top of that. So I think it should be maybe a mix of both sides. Ginger, do you have any?
Yeah, I can add to that as far I can think of a few examples to illustrate. So with a major use case of our forecast is capacity planning, right? And so we have to, when we think about building another data center, this takes time. So, you know, they want forecast for the long term. You know, we even provide up to 5 years, which have a lot of uncertainty, obviously. But I think, you know, so they're buying hardware and they're setting hardware roadmaps for the infrastructure that they're going to procure and build in the future. So we can, I mean, we provide forecasts. You know, one quote I just recently heard was, you know, you never provide a point forecast without an uncertainty estimate, right? So I think we can give uncertainty, but we should also be advising on kind of level uncertainty and what does that mean for the decisions they're actually making. So a lot of the decisions that they make for longer term are obviously reversible or they can change, but I think, you know, understanding what are the hard cutoffs for these decisions that they make and trying to recommend a good uncertainty estimate to use so they can build in the right amount of headroom. Yeah, and then, yeah, I guess with the network, I think networking, planning for networking, a lot of those projects, like right now we're working on, you know, more subsea cable investment. So these are like really long-term projects, right? So giving them an estimate of what connectivity or how much traffic would flow from one continent to another based on the infrastructure is kind of, it kind of depends on, you know, overall global connectivity and kind of if you build it, they will come. So yeah, a lot of just in the long term, we can provide more guidance on what that uncertainty looks like and which kind of confidence levels they should be using to make their decisions.
Okay, great. There's a couple more questions. Here's the next one. Some thoughts on writing and managing test cases, both unit and integration, tests for both models and forecasts.
Yes, I can talk a little bit about this. I don't have, again, a perfect answer, but I can say that these are extremely important. Some of the things that we do try to do is all of that I mentioned about having a good data quality control. All of that is tested with unit tests in a certain way. I don't know if unit test is the right name for that, but they are tested like every day when we are getting new data. We check if there's anything wrong going on with it. Like there are simple tests like, are we expecting 1,000? Are we getting 0? Or are we getting 10 million? These are probably bad. There is the all of the anomaly detection that we do in terms of using the forecast itself to understand where that data should be. And that goes back into the data quality tests that are done. There are some of the tests that we do with the model itself. So we're trying to understand if the model might be mispredicting the data. That start to get a little bit murky on the difference between the data being bad or the model being bad. But we can think of the model being bad when it's a little bit more of a long-term problem that we are seeing the data, or for slow moving that is happening a little bit more. But those are things that are extremely important, especially if you're trying to do this for, again, many time series where you can't look at these daily and manually understand what is going on.
Right. Yeah. Especially with network traffic data, which tends to be pretty volatile. You'll have maybe they'll switch kind of a networking topology or something, and you have bad data in one country. So if you're looking at there's going to be a lot more outliers when you're looking at high dimension of granularities, right? So like 200 plus countries, and it's going to be hard to manually do quality control on those. So we do a lot of automatic detection of, okay, if the forecast changes by X%, send me an alert, or if the moving average of the forecasting error exceeds a certain threshold, send me an error. So anything we can automate, just given the scale that we're doing the forecasting at, is helpful to have the automation.
Elaine, I think you are on mute.
Sorry about that. One last question. How would your forecasting practices differ if it was a smaller company with a limited number of data scientists or resources?
Yeah, well, I think I started with one person working on this, and then kind of the team grew over time. But yeah, I would say of course, the level of resources aren't, if you don't have the capital and the amount of people that you need. I would say focusing on just doing whatever automation you can to scale yourself, right? I mean, if you're one forecaster and you want to increase the amount of forecasts you do, you can build repeatability into your work and rely on automation for doing some of the model selection, and then looking at cases where it doesn't perform well, or a lot of times you can, for 80% of the models, right, they're sort of well behaved, and then you spend your time on the other 20%. So just think about scaling yourself. What's the biggest sort of waste of time that you have on the forecasting work, and then build a tool that will help you cut that out.
Okay, and there is one last question that you did touch upon, I think, potentially. Let me know if there's anything more you want to add to this, that as forecasting methods delve deeper into ML territory, should forecasters follow the ML community and start looking into interpretability?
Yeah, I would say yes. Yeah, I think I mean, last year at the summit, I saw, I mean, Slavic was showing us, you know, kind of we're at a turning point where ML models are, you know, as good or better than a lot of experts developing their own forecasting, you know, so using some subject matter expertise to do transformations and things, and then letting the ML do more of the model selection. So yeah, I would say definitely we are have passed that turning point where it is an important aspect of what we should know.
I can point also to the newer profit that I mentioned briefly in the presentation. One of the high things, like one of the things that are pretty important in developing that is exactly interpretability of the forecast. So that is certainly something that we see quite a lot as like a very high priority need.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions, and we're about out of time. So I want to thank you again for a really enlightening presentation, and thank you everyone for being here in these virtual days, and you know, keeping ISF going in this new format. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this session.
Thank
Thank
you, Elaine.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
It's a little cutout, huh? I'm just gonna tell him thanks.
Thank you so much.
All right. Yeah, I'll see you in another session.
Excellent.
All right. Take care. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.